Simone Biles is now back at home resting after what she calls, quote, one of the scariest experiences of her life. Of course, we all know who Simone is. She is the GOAT, one of the greatest Olympic athletes of all time. And she shared this news of her near-death experience in a post that she put online.
In elite sport,
Simone Biles has spent more than a decade being described as the greatest gymnast who ever lived. But greatness has never shielded her from hardship. Behind the medals, the world records, and the skills that carry her own name in the sport's official code of points, her life has been shaped again and again by moments that had nothing to do with a scoreboard. Lately, that pattern has resurfaced in a way that has worried millions of fans. Started with quiet but alarming posts that appeared on her Instagram stories with almost no warning at all. On June 6, 2026, Biles shared a photo of her own arm, wrapped in a stack of hospital wristbands, the kind patients are given when they are formally admitted for treatment. There was no press release, no statement from a publicist, and no appearance on a morning show to explain it. Just a short, raw caption telling fans that she had nearly died earlier that week, and that it was one of the most frightening experiences of her life. She added that she had spent days afterward resting in bed, thanking the small circle of people who checked in, visited, or sent flowers while she recovered. What made the moment even harder, she explained, was that her husband, Indianapolis Colts safety Jonathan Owens, was away at team practices in Indiana when the emergency happened, meaning she faced the most frightening hours of her life essentially alone. Biles did not name a diagnosis, a hospital, or a treating physician, and as of this recording, no further medical details have been confirmed publicly. In the days that followed, she posted softer images from home, resting alongside her two French bulldogs while friends and family filled her room with flowers, a sign that she was stable and recovering even if the full story remained private. That restraint is consistent with how she has handled her health throughout her career. Open about the emotional and psychological toll of her sport, but careful about which physical details she shares with the public. Fans and outlets immediately filled the information gap with guesses, ranging from exhaustion to a cardiac event to something entirely unrelated to athletics. But none of that speculation has been confirmed by anyone close to her, and it is worth treating it as exactly that, speculation rather than fact. The timing also stood out. Just weeks earlier, in April, she had told CNN that her decision about competing at the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics still felt like a coin flip, and that time to make that call was running short, since nearly half of 2026 had already passed. She had spent that same spring in the public eye for entirely different reasons, appearing at the Laureus World Sports Awards in Madrid as an ambassador and accepting a spot on the speaker lineup for a major international summit, the kind of high-profile, high-energy schedule that made the sudden hospitalization weeks later feel even more jarring by comparison. A health scare serious enough to land her in a hospital only adds another layer of uncertainty to a decision she was already wrestling with, and it is the kind of moment that tend to force any elite athlete to reconsider how much more their body is left to give. To understand why so many people reacted to that Instagram post with more than ordinary concern, it helps to look back at where Simone Biles started, because instability found her long before fame did. She was born in March 1997 in Columbus, Ohio, into a household that was already struggling. Her biological mother battled substance abuse problems severe enough that she could not consistently care for her children, and Simone and her siblings were eventually placed into the foster care system. For a young child, that meant a string of unfamiliar homes, shifting caregivers, and no real sense of permanence, the kind of chaos that most people only ever read about rather than live through before they have even started elementary school. It was her grandfather, Ron Biles, a former Air Force sergeant, and his wife Nellie, a nurse, who stepped in and formally adopted Simone and her younger sister, Audria, raising them together in Spring, Texas, just outside Houston. That single decision gave Simone something her early years had never offered: stability, a disciplined household, consistent schooling, and a support system that allowed her to simply be a kid rather than constantly adapting to new homes and new rules, set the stage for everything that came afterward. Without that adoption, it is hard to imagine the rest of her story unfolding the way it did, since the structure her grandparents built around her became the foundation that elite sport later demanded. It was almost by accident that gymnastics entered her life at all. A daycare field trip took her to a local gym, where coaches noticed her unusual strength and body control almost immediately. Within a few years, she was training formally under coach Amy Borman, and what started as a fun outlet for a hyperactive kid slowly turned into one of the most disciplined athletic apprenticeships in American sports history. Few people in that gym in the early 2000s could have guessed that the small girl learning basic tumbling passes would go on to rewrite the sport's record books before she turned 30. Biles' breakthrough on the world stage came at the 2013 World Championships in Antwerp, Belgium, where, at just 16 years old, she won the all-around title along with gold on floor exercise and bronze on both vault and balance beam. It was an extraordinary debut for a teenager who had only recently moved up to the senior elite ranks, and it announced her as a serious threat across every apparatus rather than a specialist in just one event. It was only the beginning. Over the years that followed, she built a level of difficulty into her routines that judges and rival federations struggled to keep up with, repeatedly forcing the sport's scoring system to adjust to skills that simply had not existed at that level before. Several of those skills became so complex and so uniquely hers that they now carry her name in gymnastics' official code of points, including a punishing double twisting, double flipping vault, and multiple floor exercise elements that other competitors rarely even attempt, let alone land cleanly in competition. At the 2016 Rio Olympics, that dominance translated into 4 gold medals and a bronze, cementing her as the face of American gymnastics and one of the most decorated athletes of her generation at just 19 years old. Each of those record-breaking skills, though, came at a steep physical cost, built on thousands of repetitions and landings that place forces on the body far beyond what casual training requires, a toll that does not disappear simply because the routines look effortless on television. Elite gymnastics at that level typically means multiple training sessions a day, high-impact landings repeated until they become automatic, and a level of conditioning most people never approach in their lives. Maintaining that standard year after year, while also pushing difficulty even higher than the standard she herself had set, meant Biles was essentially competing against no one but her own previous performances, a position that brought immense pressure even as it brought historic success. Even as her career reached new heights, a much darker story was unfolding behind the scenes of USA Gymnastics. Dr. Larry Nassar, the organization's longtime team physician, had been abusing athletes for years under the cover of medical treatment, a betrayal that eventually came to light through the bravery of survivors who refused to stay silent any longer. In January 2018, Simone Biles became one of the most prominent athletes to publicly confirm that she, too, had been abused by Nassar, joining more than 150 survivors who gave impact statements during his sentencing hearings. Nassar was ultimately sentenced to decades in prison on both state and federal charges, but the legal outcome only told part of the story. Congressional hearings later exposed years of institutional failure, where complaints had reportedly been ignored or mishandled by the very organizations meant to protect young athletes' training within their system. Biles used her platform during that period to criticize USA Gymnastics directly, arguing publicly that the organization had prioritized its reputation and competitive success over the safety of the athletes training under its name. That stance demanded real courage from someone still competing at the highest level of her sport, since speaking out against the same federation responsible for selecting Olympic teams carried obvious risk to her own career. Yet she continued to compete for Team USA throughout this period, carrying the weight of that institutional betrayal into training halls and arenas that had once been the site of the abuse itself, a burden that very few of her competitors had to manage alongside their own athletic preparation. That history of institutional trauma resurfaced in an unexpected way at the postponed 2020 Tokyo Olympics, a games already reshaped by empty arenas, strict isolation protocols, and a year-long delay caused by the global pandemic. During the team final, Biles attempted a vault and immediately knew something was wrong upon landing. She withdrew from the competition shortly after, later explaining that she had lost what gymnasts call her twisties, a frightening and dangerous disconnect between her brain's sense of where her body is in the air and what her body actually does during a rotation. In a sport where a single mistimed landing can cause serious spinal or neck injury, continuing to compete in that state was simply not safe, and Biles said so publicly and without apology, even as it meant stepping back from event after event she had qualified to compete in, including the all-around final she had entered as the heavy favorite. The reaction was sharply divided, with many praising her honesty about mental health, and others questioning whether she should step back at all in the middle of an Olympic final. She returned for one final event in Tokyo, a simplified balance beam routine that traded difficulty for stability, and it earned her a bronze medal, a result she later described as one of the proudest moments of her career, precisely because of how hard it had been to get back on the podium at all under that much scrutiny. In interviews afterward, she connected the breakdown in Tokyo not to a single bad day, but to years of accumulated pressure, including the unresolved psychological weight of the NASA scandal she had lived through years earlier, combined with the postponed Olympics and the isolation of competing without the usual support of crowd or a normal training cycle. Rather than let that moment define the end of her story, Biles spent the following years rebuilding, both physically and mentally, before returning to elite competition with renewed purpose. That comeback was never guaranteed. For a long stretch after Tokyo, even close observers of the sport were not certain she would return to competition at all, let alone at the level required to contend for another Olympic team. At the 2024 Paris Olympics, she walked away with 4 medals, an emphatic answer to anyone who had doubted whether she could come back from Tokyo at full strength. Throughout that comeback, she remained remarkably open about therapy, anxiety, and the ongoing work it took to feel ready to compete again, a level of transparency that was rare among athletes still active at the top of their sport. That honesty reshaped public conversations about mental health far beyond gymnastics, encouraging athletes across multiple sports and countries to speak more openly about pressures they had previously kept private out of fear it would be seen as weakness. Her personal life has unfolded under that same intense spotlight. She began dating NFL safety Jonathan Owens in 2020, and the relationship quickly became public knowledge as her profile grew even larger after Tokyo. The couple got engaged in 2022 and married in 2023, but even their marriage has not been immune to public scrutiny, including viral moments and online debates over comments Owens made in interviews, which Biles publicly defended against what she called exaggerated and disrespectful criticism. Owens has continued his own NFL career, more recently joining the Indianapolis Colts, a move that has meant periods of separation between the couple during his off-season training and practice schedule, including, notably, the week of her recent hospitalization. Through all of it, she has continued to talk about protecting her mental and physical health as a non-negotiable part of how she operates, even when that openness invites criticism from people who expect athletes to simply push through in silence rather than speak honestly about what they are going through. Which brings the story back to where it started, with Biles resting at home in June 2026, recovering from a medical emergency serious enough that she described it as nearly fatal. At 29 years old, she is no longer in the early, invincible phase of her career, and this scare lands at a moment when she is already weighing one of the biggest decisions of her life, whether to chase a 4th Olympic Games in Los Angeles in 2028. She has been candid that the choice is close to 50-50, and that time to decide is running out. A health scare like this one does not make that decision any easier, and it adds yet another chapter to a life that has rarely given her an easy stretch of road. From foster care to Olympic glory, from surviving abuse within her own sport to walking away from competition for the sake of her own safety, Simone Biles has built her legacy as much on resilience as on talent, whatever this latest health scare turns out to be. And whatever she ultimately decides about 2028, her story so far suggests she has never been the type to let a setback have the final word. Only time will tell what comes next, but if her past is any indication, betting against Simone Biles has rarely been a smart move.